What happens when a single musical note can shatter the foundation of one of America's most celebrated cultural dynasties? For Rebecca Turner, a 28-year-old server at an upscale restaurant in Boston's Back Bay, that note came hidden within a melody she'd heard her grandmother hum 1,000 times. For Harrison Caldwell, a man whose family's name graced concert halls and opera houses across the nation, it was the sound that would either expose his legacy as a lie or prove that greatness sometimes wears a borrowed crown. She was just trying to make rent while caring for her ailing grandmother. He was just another wealthy patron seeking privacy in the restaurant's exclusive wine room. But when Rebecca recognized the haunting melody playing softly from his phone, the same lullaby her grandmother claimed to have composed decades ago, a whispered question would unlock a vault of stolen creativity, spanning half a century. This isn't a story about coincidence. This is about how a forgotten song revealed the systematic theft of a brilliant composer's life work, the silencing of a musical genius, and the secret that one of America's most prestigious arts families thought was buried beneath decades of false acclaim. The evening shift at Bellecourt was a carefully orchestrated performance that Rebecca Turner knew by heart. Crystal glasses caught the warm glow of Edison bulbs. Conversations flowed in hushed tones over plates of $30 pasta. And the soft classical music that drifted through the dining room provided the perfect soundtrack to Boston's elite at play. At 9:15 p.m. on a rainy October evening, Rebecca was already 7 hours into her shift, her feet aching in regulation black shoes. Her crisp white shirt still somehow immaculate despite the chaos of dinner service. She balanced 3 wine glasses on a silver tray, navigating between tables with the fluid grace that came from 2 years of serving Boston's wealthiest residents. The private dining room in the back was reserved tonight. Another business dinner where men in $1,000 suits would discuss million-dollar deals over aged Bordeaux and dry-aged steaks. Rebecca approached the mahogany door of the Brahms Room, named like all of Bellecourt's private spaces after classical composers. She knocked softly and entered to find a single diner seated at the table for 8, a man who commanded attention even in solitude. Harrison Caldwell was classical music royalty in Boston. His great-grandfather had founded the Caldwell Foundation, which funded orchestras and opera companies across New England. The family name was engraved on buildings, concert programs, and scholarship awards. Harrison himself served on the boards of the Boston Symphony Orchestra and 3 prestigious conservatories. He sat with his back to the window, the city lights creating a halo effect around his perfectly styled salt and pepper hair. His phone rested on the white tablecloth beside his untouched glass of wine, and from its speaker came the soft strains of a piano melody that made Rebecca's world stop spinning. The music was hauntingly beautiful, a gentle, melancholic piece in a minor key that seemed to capture both deep sorrow and transcendent hope. But it wasn't the beauty that froze Rebecca in place. It was recognition so profound it felt like a physical blow. She knew this melody. She had known it her entire life. Every night of her childhood, her grandmother Rose had hummed this exact song while tucking her into bed. During the long afternoons, when Rebecca was homesick from school, Rose would play it on their old upright piano, her arthritic fingers still finding every note with muscle memory. When Rebecca had asked about the song's origin, Rose would smile mysteriously and say, "It's something I wrote long ago, sweetheart. When I still believed the world would listen to what I had to say." "Excuse me, sir," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The music playing on your phone. What is it?" Harrison looked up with mild annoyance, clearly not accustomed to being interrupted by service staff. "It's a piece by Marcus Caldwell, my grandfather. Nocturne in E minor. It's being featured in next month's tribute concert at Symphony Hall." Rebecca's hands began to tremble, nearly dropping the wine glasses. "I'm sorry, but are you certain about the composer?" Harrison's expression shifted from annoyance to cold calculation. "Young lady, I think I know my own family's musical heritage. This piece was composed by my grandfather in 1954 and premiered by the Boston Philharmonic in 1955. It's been recorded dozens of times and is considered one of his masterworks. But that's impossible, Rebecca breathed, setting the tray down with shaking hands. My grandmother has been playing this song since she was young. She composed it herself in the late 1940s. I've heard her play it 1,000 times. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Harrison slowly placed his phone face down on the table, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Miss," he said, his voice carrying the authority of generations of wealth and influence, "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but I suggest you be very careful about making accusations against my family. My grandfather, Marcus Caldwell, was one of America's most celebrated composers. Your grandmother, whoever she is either confused or lying." The casual cruelty of his dismissal ignited something fierce in Rebecca's chest. "Her name is Rose Turner, and she's neither confused nor a liar. She's a brilliant composer who never got the recognition she deserved." Harrison stood abruptly, his imposing 6-foot frame making the spacious room feel suddenly small. He pulled out his wallet and placed $200 on the table. "This conversation is over. If I hear so much as a whisper of these ridiculous claims outside this room, my lawyers will ensure your grandmother's remaining years are spent in court rather than at a piano." He moved toward the door, then paused without turning around. "Your grandmother's delusions are sad, Miss Turner, but they're also dangerous. I'd advise you to help her distinguish between fantasy and reality before someone gets hurt." The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like a gavel falling. Rebecca stood alone in the Brahms room, staring at the money on the table that felt like blood payment for her silence. The drive to her grandmother's apartment in Dorchester took 25 minutes through Boston's late-night traffic, but it felt like hours. Harrison Caldwell's words echoed in her mind like a curse. Delusions, fantasy, lies. Each accusation felt like a dagger aimed at the heart of everything Rebecca knew about the woman who had raised her. Rose Turner lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment filled with the accumulated treasures of a long life. Photographs of her late husband, books of poetry with cracked spines, and sheet music stacked on every available surface. The upright piano that dominated the living room was a 1940s Baldwin that Rose had bought second-hand and maintained with religious devotion. Rebecca found her grandmother in her usual evening spot, seated at the piano bench in her lavender nightgown, her silver hair braided down her back. Her fingers moved across the keys with surprising strength for someone approaching 85, playing the same melody Rebecca had heard in the restaurant. "Grandma Rose." The music stopped, and Rose turned with a warm smile that made Rebecca's heart ache. Her grandmother's mind remained sharp despite her age, her green eyes still bright with intelligence and humor. "Rebecca, sweetheart, you're late tonight. Busy evening at the restaurant?" "Something like that." Rebecca sat on the small sofa facing the piano. "Grandma, I need to ask you about your song. The one you were just playing." Rose's expression grew thoughtful. "My nocturne. What about it, dear? You said you composed it in the late 1940s. Are you absolutely certain about that?" "Of course I'm certain. I wrote it in 1948, right after your grandfather proposed. I was so happy, so full of hope about our future together. The melody just came to me one evening while I was walking along the Charles River." Rose's eyes grew distant with memory. "I played it for him the next day, and he said it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard." Rebecca pulled out her phone and played the recording she'd captured in the restaurant. Rose's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, confusion, and then something that looked like fear. "Where did you get this recording?" Rose asked, her voice tight. "A man named Harrison Caldwell was playing it in the restaurant tonight. He claims his grandfather, Marcus Caldwell, composed it in 1954. The color drained from Rose's face. She gripped the edge of the piano bench so tightly her knuckles went white. "That name," she whispered. "I haven't heard that name in decades. You knew Marcus Caldwell." Rose was silent for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I worked for him, Rebecca. In 1949, I was hired as his personal assistant and music copyist. It was my dream job, working for one of Boston's most celebrated composers, learning from a master. She stood slowly and walked to an old cedar chest in the corner of the room. From it, she pulled out a manila envelope yellowed with age. Marcus Caldwell was struggling when I started working for him. The critics were saying he'd lost his touch, that his recent compositions lacked the emotional depth of his earlier work. He was desperate for inspiration. Rose opened the envelope and pulled out several sheets of handwritten music, the ink faded but still legible. I made the mistake of sharing some of my own compositions with him. I thought he might help me get them published, maybe even performed. He was so encouraging, so supportive of my work. Rebecca looked at the sheet music and felt her heart sink. At the top of the first page, in Rose's distinctive handwriting, was the title Nocturne in E minor and the date April 1948. "What happened, Grandma?" "He stole them," Rose said simply, her voice hollow with old pain. "Not just the Nocturne. 6 of my best pieces. He rearranged a few measures here and there, changed some instrumentation, but the core melodies, the emotional architecture, it was all mine." The sheets of music trembled in Rose's hands as she continued. "The first piece he premiered was my Nocturne in the fall of 1954. I was in the audience that night, Rebecca. I sat in the balcony of Symphony Hall and watched as my own composition was credited to Marcus Caldwell. The applause was thunderous. The critics called it his triumphant return to form. Didn't you try to fight it? To prove they were yours?" Rose laughed bitterly. "I was a 24-year-old woman with no family money, no connections, no power. Marcus Caldwell was musical royalty. Who would have believed me?" She walked back to the piano and sat down heavily. "But I tried, Rebecca. God help me, I tried. I went to music publishers, to other composers, to journalists. I had my original manuscripts, my dated notebooks. But Marcus had something I didn't have." "What?" "Lawyers, influence, and a complete willingness to destroy anyone who threatened his reputation." Rose's voice grew stronger, fueled by decades of suppressed anger. "Within a month of my first attempt to prove the truth, I was blacklisted from every musical institution in Boston. No one would hire me, no one would even look at my compositions. I received anonymous phone calls warning me to stop making wild accusations against respected artists. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Rebecca thought of Harrison Caldwell's threat about lawyers, his casual cruelty in dismissing her grandmother's claims. "The last call I received," Rose continued, "wasn't anonymous. It was from Marcus Caldwell himself. He told me that talented young women sometimes had accidents, that it would be tragic if something happened to me before I could fulfill my potential as a wife and mother." Rose turned to face Rebecca, and in her eyes was a fire that hadn't dimmed despite decades of silence. "So I stopped fighting, Rebecca. I married your grandfather, moved to Dorchester, and never publicly played my compositions again. But I never stopped playing them for the people I loved. I never let them die completely." The weight of her grandmother's stolen legacy settled on Rebecca's shoulders like a leaden cloak. For over 70 years, Rose Turner had carried this secret, watching as another man received acclaim for her creative genius. "Grandma, we have to tell the truth. We have to expose what he did." Rose shook her head sadly. "Marcus Caldwell is dead, sweetheart. He died in 1987, and the musical world has spent decades celebrating his genius. My word against his legacy, against the Caldwell Foundation and all their power. But you have proof. The original manuscripts, the dates. Paper can be forged, dates can be altered. They'll say I'm a bitter old woman seeking attention, and even if some people believe me, what then? Do you think the Boston Symphony Orchestra will admit they've been performing stolen music for 70 years? Do you think the Caldwell Foundation will acknowledge their fortune was built on theft?" Rebecca understood her grandmother's despair, but she also felt a fierce determination building in her chest. "Maybe not. But Harrison Caldwell needs to know the truth. Maybe he's different from his grandfather. Rose's expression was skeptical but hopeful. "You really think he'll listen?" "I think he deserves the chance to do the right thing." That night, Rebecca researched everything she could find about the Caldwell family and their musical legacy. What she discovered made her grandmother's story even more tragic. Marcus Caldwell's Renaissance period, the compositions that had cemented his reputation as one of America's great composers, had begun in 1954 with the premiere of Nocturne in E minor. Over the next decade, he had produced a series of acclaimed works that critics praised for their emotional sophistication and melodic innovation. But when Rebecca looked deeper into the timeline, she found troubling patterns. Each of Marcus Caldwell's acclaimed pieces had premiered shortly after he'd hired a new assistant or worked with a promising young composer. And in several cases, those assistants had left Boston abruptly, their own musical careers mysteriously stalled. Rose Turner wasn't Marcus Caldwell's only victim. She was part of a systematic pattern of theft that had spanned decades. The more Rebecca dug, the angrier she became. Her grandmother's stolen compositions had generated millions in royalties, funded scholarships, and built the reputation that had made the Caldwell family cultural royalty in New England. Meanwhile, Rose had spent her life in obscurity, her genius unrecognized and unrewarded. By dawn, Rebecca had made her decision. She would confront Harrison Caldwell, but this time she would come armed with evidence that couldn't be dismissed or threatened into silence. The Caldwell Foundation occupied an elegant brownstone on Marlborough Street, its facade decorated with brass plaques listing the various cultural organizations it supported. Rebecca had called ahead, claiming to have information about a historically significant composition that might interest Mr. Caldwell for the upcoming tribute concert. Harrison's office was a shrine to his family's musical legacy. The walls were lined with photographs of famous conductors, framed letters from renowned composers, and awards recognizing the family's contributions to classical music. A Steinway grand piano dominated one corner of the room, its surface covered with manuscripts and sheet music. Harrison looked up from his desk with barely concealed impatience as Rebecca entered. "Miss Turner, I believe I made myself clear last evening. I have no interest in entertaining your grandmother's fantasies." "They're not fantasies," Rebecca said, placing a thick folder on his desk. "They're documented facts." She opened the folder to reveal Rose's original manuscripts, dated photographs of her at the piano, and a timeline she'd constructed showing the suspicious coincidences between Marcus Caldwell's acclaimed compositions and his various assistants' departures from Boston. "Your grandfather didn't just steal my grandmother's nocturne," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "He built his entire late-career reputation on the work of young composers he systematically exploited." Harrison glanced at the materials with studied indifference. But Rebecca caught the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Even if these documents were authentic," he said carefully, "which I'm not conceding, what exactly do you hope to accomplish? My grandfather has been dead for nearly 40 years. This is ancient history. Ancient history that's still generating revenue for your foundation. Ancient history that your family continues to celebrate and profit from." Rebecca leaned forward. "The tribute concert next month will feature 6 compositions that were stolen from my grandmother and others. You're not honoring your grandfather's legacy, you're perpetuating his crimes." For the first time, Harrison's composed facade cracked slightly. "You have no idea what you're talking about. The financial and legal implications of what you're suggesting are exactly why you've been so quick to threaten and dismiss me," Rebecca interrupted. "Because deep down, you know I'm telling the truth." Harrison stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. "Let's say, hypothetically, that some of my grandfather's later works were influenced by his collaborations with various assistants," he said finally, his voice carefully measured. "What would you have me do? Destroy my family's reputation? Bankrupt the foundation? Shut down the scholarships and programs that have helped thousands of young musicians?" "I'd have you tell the truth," Rebecca said simply. Acknowledge what really happened and honor the people whose work made your grandfather famous. Harrison turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. And if I were to consider such an acknowledgement, what assurances would I have that this wouldn't become a public scandal? That other families of my grandfather's collaborators wouldn't come forward with similar claims? The question hung in the air between them, and Rebecca realized that her fight was bigger than just her grandmother's stolen compositions. Marcus Caldwell had victimized multiple people, and the evidence was probably still hidden somewhere in the Foundation's archives. "There's only one way to find out," she said. "Open the records. All of them. Let an independent musicologist examine the manuscripts, the correspondence, the employment records. If your grandfather was innocent, the evidence will prove it. If he wasn't, then I'll have destroyed everything my family has built for the past century." Rebecca felt a moment of sympathy for Harrison. He hadn't created this situation, and exposing the truth would indeed have devastating consequences for his family's legacy and financial stability. But then she thought of her grandmother playing her stolen compositions alone in her apartment, her genius unrecognized and unrewarded. "Some things are more important than reputation and money," she said quietly. "Like justice, like truth, like making sure brilliant artists get the recognition they deserve, even if it comes decades too late." Harrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents in the folder. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation. "There's something you need to know about my cousin Jeffrey. He's been pushing for a comprehensive biography of our grandfather, complete access to all the private papers and correspondence. I've been resisting because—" he paused. "Because I've always suspected there were things in those archives that were better left buried." The admission was a crack in the dam, and Rebecca could sense the flood of truth waiting behind it. "What kind of things?" "Correspondence with assistants who left abruptly. Financial records of unusual payments. Legal documents that were sealed for decades." Harrison's face was pale. "Jeffrey thinks exposing everything will make our family look more human, more relatable. He doesn't realize it might expose us as frauds." The pieces were falling into place. Jeffrey Caldwell, like Richard Whitmore in Rebecca's previous imaginings, was a potential threat, someone who might use the family's secrets for his own purposes. "Where is Jeffrey now?" Rebecca asked. "He's supposed to meet me here in an hour to discuss the tribute concert program. He's been particularly insistent about featuring the nocturne prominently." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. If Jeffrey was planning to expose the family's secrets for his own gain, her grandmother could become collateral damage in a much larger scandal. "I think we need to have a conversation with your cousin," she said. "All three of us together. Because if this is going to come out anyway, it should be on our terms, not his." Harrison nodded slowly, the weight of decades of family lies finally becoming too heavy to bear alone. "Miss Turner," he said quietly, "I'm beginning to think you're right about more than just the nocturne." The confrontation came sooner than expected. Jeffrey Caldwell arrived early, sweeping into Harrison's office with the entitled confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. He was younger than Harrison, perhaps 45, with the kind of aggressive ambition that often came with being the second son in a wealthy family. "Harrison, we need to discuss the tribute concert budget. I've been thinking we should—" He stopped mid-sentence when he noticed Rebecca. "Who is this?" "Jeffrey, this is Rebecca Turner. She has some information about grandfather's compositions that I think you'll find illuminating." Something in Harrison's tone made Jeffrey's eyes narrow. He looked from Harrison to Rebecca and back again, his politician's instincts clearly sensing danger. "What kind of information?" Rebecca opened the folder and spread Rose's manuscripts across Harrison's desk. "The kind that proves your grandfather built his reputation on stolen music." Jeffrey's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of surprise or denial, his face went through a rapid series of calculations, surprise, recognition, and then something that looked almost like relief. "Well, he said, settling into a chair with studied casualness. "I was wondering when this would finally surface." Harrison stared at his cousin in shock. "You knew?" "Of course I knew," Geoffrey said with a dismissive wave. "Did you think I was planning a comprehensive biography without doing comprehensive research? I've known about the Turner woman and several others for months." The casual way he referred to Rose as the Turner woman made Rebecca's blood boil, but she forced herself to remain calm. "And you were planning to do what with that information?" she asked. Geoffrey's smile was predatory. "Use it, of course. The art world loves a redemption story, a tale of historical injustice finally being corrected. Imagine the publicity we'll get when the Caldwell Foundation magnanimously acknowledges past wrongs and establishes a fund for the families of exploited composers." He leaned forward, his eyes bright with ambition. "We'll be heroes, Harrison. Progressive cultural leaders who chose transparency over tradition. The donations will pour in from people who want to be associated with our courage and integrity." Rebecca felt sick. Geoffrey wasn't planning to honor her grandmother's legacy. He was planning to exploit it all over again, using Rose's stolen compositions as a marketing tool for his own advancement. "And what about the people your grandfather actually hurt?" she demanded. "What about their right to be acknowledged as the true creators of this music?" "They'll be acknowledged," Geoffrey said smoothly. "In footnotes, in press releases, in the small print on program notes. They'll get their recognition, just not in a way that overshadows the Caldwell name." Harrison had been listening in growing horror. "Geoffrey, you can't be serious. These people deserve more than footnotes. They deserve justice." "Justice," Geoffrey laughed. "Harrison, this is the real world. We can't undo what grandfather did, but we can control how the story gets told. We can make ourselves look good while giving the victims just enough acknowledgement to avoid lawsuits." It was exactly the kind of cynical manipulation that had allowed Marcus Caldwell's crimes to remain hidden for decades. Rebecca realized that Geoffrey represented everything that was wrong with the system that had silenced her grandmother. Wealth and power, using their influence to control narratives and minimize consequences. "No," Rebecca said firmly, "that's not going to happen." Geoffrey's friendly facade finally slipped. "I'm sorry, who exactly do you think you are?" "A waitress from Dorchester thinks she can dictate terms to the Caldwell Foundation." "A waitress whose grandmother was robbed of her life's work," Rebecca shot back. "And who has enough evidence to make sure the real story gets told, with or without your cooperation." "Evidence?" Geoffrey scoffed. "You have some old sheet music and the word of a woman approaching 90. Good luck proving anything in court." But Rebecca had been thinking about this moment since her conversation with Harrison. She pulled out her phone and opened a recording app. "Actually, I have your confession. Your admission that you've known about your grandfather's theft for months and were planning to exploit it for your own benefit." Geoffrey's face went white as he realized what she'd done. "You recorded our conversation?" "Massachusetts is a one-party consent state," Rebecca said calmly. "I only need my own permission to record, and I think the media will be very interested in hearing how the Caldwell Foundation planned to turn their founders' crimes into a public relations coup." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the antique clock. Geoffrey looked trapped, his carefully laid plans crumbling around him. Harrison finally spoke, his voice heavy with disgust. "Geoffrey, you're off the foundation board, effective immediately. Security will escort you out." "You can't do this," Geoffrey sputtered. "The family trust, the bylaws, give me plenty of authority to remove board members for conduct detrimental to the Foundation's mission," Harrison finished. "I think exploiting theft victims for publicity qualifies." As security arrived to escort Geoffrey out, he turned back to Rebecca with undisguised hatred. "You think you've won something here? You've destroyed a century of cultural legacy for what? So your grandmother can feel vindicated? This foundation funds orchestras, scholarships, music education programs. When this scandal breaks, all of that disappears. "Congratulations, you've hurt more musicians than my grandfather ever did." The accusation hit harder than Rebecca had expected because there was truth in it. Exposing Marcus Caldwell's crimes would indeed have far-reaching consequences for innocent people who benefited from the Foundation's work. But as Jeffrey was led away, still shouting threats and accusations, Rebecca thought of her grandmother playing her stolen compositions alone in her apartment. Her brilliance, unrecognized and unrewarded for 7 decades. Some truths were worth the cost of telling. 3 months later, the story broke simultaneously in the Boston Globe, the New York Times, and Classical Music Today. The headlines were devastating. Boston music dynasty built on stolen compositions. The great classical music fraud. How Marcus Caldwell systematically robbed young composers. The evidence was overwhelming. Working with a team of musicologists and investigative journalists, Rebecca and Harrison had uncovered not just Rose's stolen works, but compositions taken from at least 6 other young musicians between 1949 and 1965. The pattern was consistent. Promising composers would be hired as assistants. Their best works would be appropriated, and they would be forced out of the industry through intimidation and blacklisting. The scandal sent shockwaves through the classical music world. Orchestras removed Marcus Caldwell's works from their programs. Music schools renamed scholarships. The Caldwell Foundation's donations plummeted as major benefactors distanced themselves from the controversy. But Harrison had surprised everyone, including Rebecca, with his response to the crisis. Instead of trying to minimize the damage or preserve what remained of his family's reputation, he had thrown himself into making amends with a passion that bordered on obsession. The Foundation had liquidated significant assets to create a fund for the families of Marcus Caldwell's victims. Rose Turner was the first recipient, receiving not just financial compensation, but something far more valuable: public acknowledgement of her genius. The tribute concert that had originally been planned to honor Marcus Caldwell was transformed into an evening of restored music, featuring Rose's compositions performed by the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Rebecca sat in the front row, watching her 85-year-old grandmother take the stage to thunderous applause. Rose had been reluctant at first, afraid that the attention would be overwhelming at her age. But when the orchestra began playing her nocturne in E minor, properly credited and beautifully performed, tears streamed down her face as 7 decades of silence were finally broken. After the concert, Harrison approached Rebecca in the lobby. The scandal had aged him. His hair was grayer, his face more lined, but there was something lighter in his eyes, as if a great burden had been lifted. "Your grandmother was magnificent tonight," he said. "I've never heard the nocturne played with such emotional depth." "It's like hearing it for the first time," Rebecca smiled. "She always said music wasn't just notes on a page. It was the composer's soul made audible." She was right. Harrison paused. "Rebecca, I wanted to thank you for having the courage to tell the truth, even when it would have been easier to stay silent." "I almost did stay silent," Rebecca admitted. "When Jeffrey pointed out how many people would be hurt by the scandal, I wondered if I was being selfish. If my grandmother's vindication was worth destroying so much good work." "But it was worth it," Harrison said firmly, "because the good work was built on a lie. Better to start over with truth than to keep building on a foundation of theft." The Foundation had indeed been transformed. Under Harrison's leadership, it had refocused its mission on supporting living composers, particularly those from underrepresented communities. The scholarships now came with mentorship programs designed to protect young artists from exploitation. The Foundation's board included musicians, composers, and advocates who understood the power dynamics that had allowed Marcus Caldwell's crimes to continue for so long. Jeffrey had tried to fight his removal from the board, but the recorded evidence of his planned exploitation had made his position untenable. He had been forced to resign from all his cultural positions and now worked in corporate consulting, his reputation in the arts world permanently destroyed. As Rebecca watched her grandmother accept congratulations from admirers, she reflected on how a single moment of recognition had unraveled decades of lies. Rose Turner, the quiet woman who had hummed lullabies in a Dorchester apartment, was finally being celebrated as the brilliant composer she had always been. The story had reminded Rebecca that every family has its secrets, and sometimes it takes an outsider's courage to bring hidden truths to light. In a world where wealth and power often silence those who dare to speak truth, she had proven that integrity, persistence, and love for family could overcome even the most entrenched systems of exploitation. Her grandmother's compositions would now be performed by orchestras around the world, her name appearing on programs beside the great classical masters. It was justice served 7 decades late, but justice nonetheless. As they left Symphony Hall that night, Rose took Rebecca's arm and smiled up at her granddaughter. "You did something I could never do," she said softly. "You refused to let them bury the truth. I learned from you, Grandma. You taught me that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible." The Boston night air was crisp with the promise of winter, but Rebecca felt warm with the knowledge that her grandmother's legacy was finally secure. Rose Turner's music would outlive the people who had tried to silence her, and her story would inspire future generations of artists to stand up for their work and their worth. If this story of artistic integrity, family loyalty, and the power of truth moved you, what would you have done in Rebecca's situation? Would you have risked exposing a scandal that would hurt innocent people to vindicate your grandmother's stolen legacy? Share your thoughts and like this story if it resonated with you. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales of ordinary people fighting extraordinary battles against injustice and winning.